The US Navy's submarine war against Japan technically started on December the 7th, 1941, but practically the submariners had been gearing up for this fight for a couple of decades. Ever since the end of World War I had resulted in strategic evaluations that painted Japan as the most likely opponent in another war. With the lessons of the Kaiserliche Marine's U-boat campaign against the British Empire fresh in mind, including how close it had come to knocking the UK out of the war, the US Navy now turned its attention on how to cut off the economic lifeline of another island nation, if it turned out that they had to. This was all well and good. Japan had a smaller navy, relied on more overseas resources, and also had not so much first-hand experience with anti-submarine warfare as compared to the British and the Royal Navy. However, the Pacific was big, Douglas Adams style big, although of course in the 1920s they'd have no idea what that particular reference meant. Additionally, the US mainland was thousands of miles away from Japan, and all other likely trade routes that Japan might exploit, which was a problem if you wanted submarines to be able to operate against Japan for more than about 5 minutes before they had to go home again. The only positive of that particular scenario was that, unlike Germany, US subs would not have to sneak their way past blockade lines and minefields to get where they needed to go. Luckily, the US Navy had two bases much closer to Japan, Guam and the Philippines, specifically in the Philippines, Cavite, with backup of Manila. But presciently, a lot of US planners had figured that it was quite likely that Cavite might fall. Unfortunately, this also meant that the number of submarines needed to effectively disrupt Japan's efforts went up due to having to base all offensive operations out of Guam, sustained by a tenuous supply link from San Diego to Pearl Harbor and then on to Guam itself, with a few minor stops along the way. The precise number calculated was 144 submarines, which was far more than Congress would be willing to let them have. One of the major driving factors behind these calculations was the fact that even the newest US Navy submarine design, the S-Class, had a relatively short range compared to what it would likely be called upon to do. This meant the future of US submarine needs was fairly quickly established. Whereas submarines that were designed for operations in the North Sea or the Mediterranean might get away with being small, fast diving, and optimized for underwater performance as much as the technology of the time allowed, US submarines would need to have great range, high surface speed to cross those long distances in good time, and would have to prefer reliability over cutting edge when it came to machinery, since help, repairs, and spare parts might as well be on another planet if something went wrong mid-patrol. And they'd also need to be able to be refitted between those patrols relatively quickly. With limited access to reloads on their long missions, the subs would need to carry a lot of weaponry, and this would have to be able to put down the target in short order, 1 or 2 hits if possible. All of this would obviously require a large submarine, and that meant an expensive one, and that meant all of the above factors became even more important because a large expensive submarine design meant that the Congress wasn't going to allow too many to be built. But budget constraints, believe it or not, weren't even the worst issue. The first 2 interwar naval treaties, Washington and First London, placed restrictions on submarine warfare that led many in Congress to argue that the US Navy needed only small coastal submarines for home defense. Congress also decided that no foreign technology could be employed in US submarines, which was all fine and well, except for the fact that the US didn't have a diesel engine capable of submarine use that was actually worth having. Up until the mid-1930s, engine problems would top a long list of issues plaguing the relatively few subs that the US Navy was actually able to afford. Eventually, though, with the collapse of the treaty system, rising tensions across the globe, and the adoption of diesel systems adapted from railway locomotives, things began to look up, and new fleet submarines, starting with the Porpoise class, then the Salmons, Sargos and Tambors, the Mackerels being a small experimental sub, and then, finally, the Gato class. Whilst 2 further classes would come online during the war, the Gato would be the last pre-war US submarine class, and the design would be slightly adapted into the Balaos, the other major wartime class for the US submarine force. Apart from a scattering of small production runs during the interwar period, the other major class that would be available to the United States Navy by the start of the USA's involvement in World War II would be the, by then, quite old S-Class, although their capability would be significantly behind the latest models. With a fairly singular objective in mind, the new US subs had been designed with many additional extras, specifically useful in the Western Pacific. Starting in 1936, this would also include air conditioning, which would also be retrofitted to a number of submarines, although not all. The first and most obvious use of this facility was to keep the crews from dying of heat stroke as tropical waters turned their vessels into pressure cookers. But there was another purpose as well. A lot of new electronic systems, starting with the fire control computer for the torpedoes, needed an environment that wasn't dripping wet with condensation if they were to work for more than 5 minutes. This would be of great benefit in the coming years when new sonar, radar, and other electronic systems, and of course more radio equipment, was added to the submarines. The subs were also equipped with water condensers. These were vital on long missions to avoid a submarine being a 50% fresh water tanks by volume, as well as better than average food allocations and additional pay for the crew. In many ways, the submariners would view themselves as something of an elite. But there were problems as well. Of the two largest problems, one was sort of known about but was largely being ignored. The other would turn out to be a rude surprise once war was declared. The one that some officers were aware of was an attitude cultivated in many commanding officers. As peacetime and budget restrictions went on throughout the late 1920s and into the early 1930s, commanding a submarine became less an exercise in free thinking and more of a tightrope walk. Absolutely anything that went wrong was immediately counted against a captain, no matter the cause or the size of the effect. One bad move could scuttle a career. This was to the point that during fleet problem exercises, a captain who made an attack run on an enemy ship of the opposing force, but was detected, would be reprimanded, whilst a captain who was never detected, but didn't actually do anything, would be commended. This, understandably, made many captains incredibly cautious, as it would turn out, too cautious, which was coupled with a slight overemphasis on the technical aspects of how a submarine worked rather than the role of how to actually lead men and command a crew. Of course, natural leaders would also rise to the top, so the problem was not universal, and a few of the US Navy's upper echelon had also noticed the issue and were trying to change things. As the war in Europe progressed, they also began to realise that the emphasis on fighting enemy warships that dominated interwar training, which involved staying deep and firing torpedoes based purely on sound bearings, was probably not the most common scenario that US subs were likely to face. This would also have to change. The unknown issue lay with the weapons that all but the oldest submarines carried. That would take a little while to come out. With all that said, the war started for the US Navy submarines almost as soon as it did for the men and ships on Battleship Row. December 7th, 1941, saw USS Pompano, along with her sisters Plunger and Pollock, running on the surface at speed. They'd left San Francisco behind a week ago and were scheduled for arrival in Hawaii at 0800. But, as it turned out somewhat luckily, the same bad weather that had also held up the carrier USS Enterprise had slowed the three subs down. They were still just over 100 miles away when at 0817 radio reports of the Japanese first wave attack on Pearl Harbor reached them. Having pumped out as much water as was humanly possible to enhance their surface running capability, the crews now had to wait for what seemed like an age as water gradually filled the ballast tanks, and the three subs began a slower and much more cautious approach to Oahu. Just over an hour later, the appearance of a lone aircraft almost spelt the end of two of the subs. Pompano saw it and tried an emergency dive, but almost heeled over completely due to incorrect trim tank control. Whilst Plunger decided that the aircraft was probably friendly, came to the surface, and was immediately strafed by said aircraft, which was most likely a Japanese scout on its way to check out the US Navy's alternate anchorage at Lahaina Roads. But the division commander was still in something of a state of denial that there could be a war going on, and, convinced that it was all a misunderstanding with a US aircraft, he refused to signal the aircraft's course or location. Meanwhile, in Pearl Harbor itself, Other submarines were under slightly heavier attack. USS Tautog was moored adjacent to USS Dolphin, and the two crews were doing their level best to fend off Imperial Japanese Navy aircraft that were blazing and swarming all over the place, even if a single 50 caliber Browning was the sum total of their air defense capability. Out at sea, Pompano's engines were starting to break down, and now an actual US Navy aircraft was starting to appear. Although this turned out to be even more dangerous than the lone Japanese scout aircraft, since these planes were fully fueled, fully armed, and understandably just a little bit trigger-happy. Eventually, the three subs were redirected to meet up with the Gudgeon, which had been at the alternate anchorage and was now heading their way. It wouldn't be until the 9th of December that the small squadron of 4 subs would finally make it into Pearl Harbor, there to witness the devastation firsthand. A long way away and deep underwater, the large but old USS Argonaut was cruising off of Midway when gunfire was reported. It was an Imperial Japanese Navy bombardment force. Gradually, the slow, clumsy, and half-broken down Leviathan made an approach, coming across a pair of Japanese destroyers. Fortunately, the combination of the Japanese Navy's poor anti-submarine warfare doctrine and the ingrained training that made Argonaut approach running deep meant that although the US sub found itself unable to make an attack on these swift and agile surface ships, they in turn were unable to get a fix even on the rattling old sub, and both parties would live to fight another day. As word of the outbreak of hostilities spread, US submarines already at sea went to a war footing. Some, like the Sargo, based in Manila, were able to head out to sea. Others, though, would find themselves caught in the opening waves of the Japanese Western Pacific offensive. A.J. Killen was aboard USS Sea Dragon, based at Cavite in the Philippines. He, in part, recalls, "In December of 1941, we were at the Cavite Navy Yard for an overhaul. On the same day that Pearl Harbor was bombed, the Japanese wiped out all the airfields in the Philippines, thereby eliminating our air protection. On December the 10th, 1941, at 12 noon, the Navy Yard was heavily bombed. 3 flights of 27 Mitsubishi bombers flew over our Navy Yard, dropping 500-pound bombs. We did not have a gun that could touch them. They didn't even break formation. They completely destroyed the Navy Yard and the ships in dry dock. Our Sea Dragon submarine was tied up to the dock, and our sister ship, USS Sea Lion SS-195, was tied up outboard of us. The Sea Lion took a 500-pound bomb down the aft torpedo room hatch, sinking her. At that instant, one of our officers and I were on the bridge of Sea Dragon. That officer was killed by the impact of the bomb, which destroyed Sea Lion. While I was rushing down the ladder into the conning tower, another concussion knocked me 14 feet below to the control room deck. 4 knobs, about 2 inches long, were all that remained of the ladder railing into control. I fell onto one of the knobs sticking up, landing full force on the tip of my spine. I lay there senseless on the control room deck for quite a while, and then heard the captain yell, "Abandon ship!" By the time I picked myself up, managing to get topside, and was starting down the dock, the captain was then telling everyone to get back on board. After the bombers had flown away, a salvage ship, the USS Widgeon, tied up to our stern and with some effort pulled us clear of the destroyed Sea Lion. Our sub had also caught a lot of shrapnel from the Sea Lion, but luckily the pressure hull was not ruptured. We had many holes in the superstructure, and a lot of the deck was gone. We managed to get over to Manila, where we tied the submarine up to the tender USS Canopus. For 3 days, work was performed on the Sea Dragon. We worked all night long, preparing the boat to once again become seaworthy. Work was done on the Sea Dragon under the cover of darkness at night, and during the day we would have to lie on the bottom of Manila Bay until it turned dark again. The reason for this was that the Japanese chose daylight for their attacks. Finally ready for sea, on December 13th, 1941, we departed for Surabaya, Java, in the Netherlands East Indies. When we passed Corregidor and started south, we saw 3 Japanese destroyers patrolling the entrance to Manila Bay. Corregidor was an army island fort at the entrance of Manila Bay. As we proceeded to dive, the Japanese gave us our first taste of depth charging. After about 2 hours, the 3 destroyers finally left. We surfaced, and after a few days, we finally reached Surabaya, Java. We went into a Dutch dry dock, and they fixed us up as best they could. After our overhaul by the Dutch, we went out for our first offensive patrol run. We were assigned a patrol station off French Indochina. We were located outside Cam Ranh Bay, a big Japanese naval base. We made an approach on a Japanese heavy cruiser. Our captain ordered firing 4 torpedoes as the cruiser was going into their base. The torpedoes all missed. We were using Mark 14 torpedoes and having trouble with them, as was everybody else. The miss was costly. We were depth charged pretty heavily. After 55 days, we ended our patrol. We could not go back to Surabaya because the Japanese had already captured it, and so our orders were to go to Perth, Australia. The next problem for the US Navy's subs, the now infamous Mark 14 torpedo, had reared its head. As long as these issues persisted, it didn't really matter how bravely the US subs pressed their attacks. Almost none of them would amount to anything except letting the Japanese Navy know that there was a submarine in the area. The end of 1941 continued to roll on issues for the US Navy's subs. Aboard the Argonaut, it was easier to list what was working than what was broken. A distiller had stopped working, the dehumidifier was shot, she'd never had aircon fitted, and all of that meant the humidity and condensation skyrocketed, leading to numerous small electrical fires and short circuits breaking out, with the constant stream of parts being fished out of isolated equipment and then sent to the galley to be oven-dried in the hopes that the reassembled electronics might keep functioning a few more days. The situation elsewhere was scarcely any better. The survivors of the Japanese attack on Cavite were doing their best, but there were no stations planned for them to sail to, no mine-laying plans to guard their precious harbours, and a good amount of their available ammunition stock, including torpedoes, had gone up in smoke courtesy of the Imperial Japanese Navy's raids anyway. British and Dutch submarines were getting stuck in trying to defend Malaya and the Dutch East Indies, but their numbers were few, and of course these areas were yet to be fully hit by the Japanese Navy's expanding wave of assaults that would first fall in strength on the Philippines, although other landings such as in Malaya had already also been made. And of course, as the Japanese army's advance on land continued, the number of available safe harbours was getting smaller and smaller. Back in the Central Pacific, Pompano had been patched up and sent out on a recon mission, but mechanical issues and leaks continued, not helped by constantly having to dive to evade their own side's air patrols, who had yet to work out a good way to distinguish between their own subs and those of the enemy. The closest call came when 3 Dauntlesses from USS Enterprise were vectored in by a recon plane, which led to Pompano being subjected to a vicious attack that broke even more things in the sub. Leaking fuel, down an engine, and with half of their remaining machinery plant seizing up, the bewildered sub would finally surface off of Wake Island, only to find the Japanese in control of all the gun installations and the rest of the island, so they carefully slipped away. Instead, they headed for the Marshall Islands to see what was going on there, where, on the 12th of January, she had the first bit of luck thus far in the war. A spread of 4 torpedoes against a large Japanese transport appeared to result in 2 hits, although upon checking out the target it seemed that, as with many Mark 14s, these had experienced issues, in this case most likely detonating just too early or possibly running deep. Fortunately, the lightly built transport was subject to enough leaks from the shock of the nearby explosions that it eventually seemed to start to break up and sink whilst the crew worked to reload their empty tubes. Post-war, as it turned out, though, the ship had in fact survived. Of course, nothing good ever lasts, and 5 days later the sub tried to attack a patrol craft. 2 torpedoes were launched, the first of which promptly exploded shortly after leaving the tubes, which set off the second. Thus, all that was accomplished was rattling the boat around still further and alerting the patrol craft that something was up, and thus it came over to investigate. The other 2 forward tubes were fired at point-blank range. In theory, either the patrol craft would either see the torpedoes and try to turn, at which point one or the other would get it broadside on, or it would stay the course and the magnetic detonators would set off the torpedoes as they passed the patrol craft. Of course, this being the Mark 14, the patrol boat sailed straight between the 2 wakes, and the 2 torpedoes failed to do anything other than motor off towards the horizon, leaving the sub at the mercy of the depth charges carried by the Japanese Navy vessel. Luckily, the sub survived, albeit now with a bent starboard prop shaft that screamed like a banshee whenever anyone tried to get it to turn, on top of all the previously mentioned problems. Now leaking fuel, down a shaft, and with only one working main engine functioning, the Pompano eventually limped home, to fetch up at Pearl nearby to the Argonaut, which was back from Midway with so much damp inside the submarine that it more closely resembled a culture dish for mildew, the crew having simply heaved out their blackened mattresses straight out the hatch the moment that they could. The older sub was headed back for San Diego for a complete refit, whilst Pompano was joined in Pearl Harbor overhaul by the Dolphin, which had been forced to curtail its patrol with so many mechanical issues that at one point a sailor caught one of the engineers eyeing the bedsheets and wondering how many they'd need to improvise a sail. As the rest of the first wave of submarines began to report back in, it was a depressing set of reading. So many broken parts, so many expended torpedoes, and so little result. The only amusing highlight was Gudgeon having managed to exploit US code-breaking efforts to ambush and destroy the submarine I-173, albeit not for the lack of the Mark 14s trying to sabotage the effort, as the torpedo that had hit the sub had refused to detonate. It seemed, however, that the car crash levels of kinetic energy involved in the dud, simply ramming the sub, had nonetheless done enough to fatally damage it. Worse still, Admiral Withers, the commander of the US Pacific Fleet submarines, seemed bent on refuting any ideas that the subs themselves were at fault. In some cases, he was right. Some captains and officers had been far too timid, but others were being lambasted for following Withers' own orders. Pompano's crew were told that their engines were in fact fine, when in fact it turned out that every single submarine in US service with that particular model of engine would very shortly need to have a complete power plant replacement. He also would not hear anything against the Mark 14 torpedo, despite the number of torpedoes being expended in December 1941 having been more than every single torpedo expended in wartime during the entire previous history of the United States Navy, for achieving basically nothing. Indeed, over December 1941 and January 1942, 64 targets would be attacked with no less than 144 torpedoes, resulting at the end of the day in just 10 ships confirmed sunk. In exchange, the US Navy had already lost the Sea Lion, the S-36, and the S-26. In February, only 2 more Japanese ships would be sunk, whilst the US Navy would lose USS Perch and USS Shark. A lack of coordination, meaning their own side kept attacking them, a lack of communication, meaning their torpedoes weren't working, a lack of maintenance, causing as many losses as the enemy, and a lack of a coherent plan on how and where to stop the Japanese Navy were hurting the US submariners badly. Alfred Sims was aboard S-36 for her final voyage, which gives some idea of just what kind of conditions many US subs were facing as they fell back from various bases that had been bombed or taken over. He states, "As we were retiring from our operating area, I conducted an appraisal of all equipment under my domain. At the end of her first patrol, we were detected by a Japanese destroyer off Verde Island. We submerged, and during the chase, the depth charging damaged every piece of equipment on my doubtful inventory list, and much of the equipment outside of my inventory list. We had severe air leaks from the ballast tank blow system, the radio transmitter tubes had blown, the electrical steering failed, the engine exhaust valve leaked, the port engine air compressor failed, the starboard engine air compressor lubrication failed, then the starboard engine seized. In addition, there were numerous seawater leaks requiring continuous bilge pumping. Every crew member sweated in the foul atmosphere as we worked like dogs trying to repair enough equipment to get the submarine functioning. As we fought a futile fight of failing equipment, those on watch lost control of the submarine. From depth charging, we lost planes control, but the diving officer was able to keep the boat somewhere between 100 and 200 feet. Then, on the next round of depth charges, the master gyro compass failed, but we managed to get it working again. Then the portside main motor bearing began smoking and had to be hand-oiled on a constant basis. The trim pump stalled. Depth was maintained by partially blowing the ballast tanks, then flooding them in short spurts to an approximate neutral buoyancy. Meanwhile, above us, the Japanese destroyer gave up and left the area. We never knew if he ran out of depth charges or just got tired of banging away at the poor old S-36. The engineman and the electrician struggled with the propulsion equipment as temperatures rose higher and higher. One man passed out, and the dock had to attend to him. The port main motor bearing problem was partially repaired, but the starboard main motor field remained grounded. We surfaced during the night, and the entire crew worked without let-up to get the boat back into operation. It was my job to get the hydraulics in order, and my back ached as I worked with inadequate tools. The only good news was that fresh air seemed to revive us, and we crammed a little food down as we worked. At daybreak, the boat submerged. Just as I thought we had enough machinery working for us to relax a bit, the main motor auxiliary circulating water pump caught fire. We received orders to proceed to Surabaya, but both shafts seized from lack of lubrication. I and 2 others crammed ourselves into the motor and bilges and hand lubricated the shafts. We were only able to make 1/3 speed, but the boat was able to return to port where repairs were made on a catch-as-catch-can basis. These were the dark days of World War II, and S-36 was pushed back out to sea. We doggedly put out to sea and continued to operate with barely running machinery whilst the crew laboured to keep the boat going by hook or by crook. We operated until so much of the boat's machinery began breaking down that we couldn't keep up with it. Then, to top off our agonising existence, the old S-36 went aground at Taka Bakang Reef. We battled to get the boat off the rocks, but chlorine gas from a hole puncture in the forward battery compartment prevented a prolonged effort. A radio message was sent and a Dutch launch, the Atla, took off all crew members of the boat. When rocking back and forth while sitting in the bottom of the launch, I thought how lucky I was to have gotten off the S-36 before she took all hands down with her. At the same time, I felt a certain sadness to see the end of the boat we had struggled so hard to save. I suppose it was just too much for the old girl. She was too tired to keep going. It wasn't entirely doom and gloom, though. Older boats, like Argonaut, that survived their first patrols were quite often now being sent back to the US for massive overhauls and refits, which left their now somewhat experienced crews high and dry. Sensibly, many of these were then redeployed to new boats coming the other way. Richard O'Kane, for example, was to become a legend in the US Navy submarine service. He'd opened the war as an officer aboard the collection of malfunctions that was loosely termed the Argonaut, but when the old boat arrived back at Mare Island, he was immediately transferred to the executive officer position on the brand new USS Wahoo, a Gato class that was still working up to commissioning. For all his other faults, and there were many, Admiral Withers was at least ordering the first wave of War Patrol reports to be circulated across the submarine fleet and beyond, which gave the service as a whole a bit of a leg up as the subs prepared for their first or second war patrols. But he also seemed to have no particular strategy, severely distrusted intel reports after Pearl Harbor was attacked, and was also faced with what he at least presented as a catch-22. His captains were increasingly insisting that the new Mark VI exploder and the associated Mark XIV torpedo in general simply weren't working. They wanted to modify the weapons to contact detonation only. But for Withers, somewhere in the region of 400 torpedoes, possibly slightly more, were already gone. A lot of them had been blown up by Japanese raids on Cavite, and the rest had been hurled largely without result at the Japanese Navy's ships. Production was slow and unlikely to pick up before summer, and Pearl Harbor had exactly 101 torpedoes left in stock, i.e. 4 complete reloads for a typical fleet submarine. On paper, the magnetic detonator on the Mark XIV should allow submarines to take single shots, thus conserving ammo, whereas contact-only detonations would require 2 to 4 torpedoes to be fired to theoretically guarantee a hit. So to him, it seemed the only solution was to keep the Mark VI exploder fully operational and order the captains to just be better with how they use their weapons. This was of course entirely unhelpful to the US subcrews, who were now beginning to feel that everyone and everything outside of their pressure holes was out to get them. Some began to modify the Mark VI exploder anyway, in secret. Others were a bit more open about the issue. Captain John Datar of the USS Tuna fired off a number of torpedoes at a freighter to no effect. He then deactivated the magnetic detonator feature, found a new target, and sank it. He included this in his War Patrol report, which was of course circulated, which then set off a blazing row between Withers and Datar, with the Admiral furious at the defiance of his explicit orders and the Captain equally furious at the apparent refusal to see common sense. With almost gallows humour, Commander George Crawford turned up in March 1942 to take command of Submarine Division 43, and reported that about the only people who seemed to be listening to the US sub-captains were the Royal Navy, of all people. His immediately previous assignment had been part of the naval attaché staff in London, where they'd been instructed to try and offer the Mark 6 exploder to the British. Despite the attaché's office noting that the British, and according to intel, the Germans, had both experienced significant issues with their own magnetic detonators already, and were currently either fixing them, or using contact-only settings, depending on the torpedo type. The Royal Navy officer who'd received the offer of the same exploder that everybody on the front lines in the Pacific knew the US Navy's own captains hated, responded with a note stating, "The extreme ingenuity of this instrument rather blinds one to its utter uselessness." Taking stock of the situation, Crawford ordered all his subs to deactivate the magnetic detonator. Withers then countermanded the order and threatened to remove Crawford. The problem, as it turned out, was more than just logistics. Withers had worked on the development of the Mark 6 exploder, and thus he was personally invested in it working as intended, regardless of what reality actually said. This seems to have been the basis of a mindset which became ever more unhelpful. Tambor reported in April that, as well as the exploder, the Mark 14 itself was running consistently too deep. The Bureau of Ordnance had actually confirmed this in a couple of tests by this point, but Withers refused to listen to either the frontline or rear echelon reports, and Buord soon changed its tack since its tests had shown a deep running of only 4 foot, as opposed to the 11 to 12 foot reported by the submariners. Spring 1942 brought changes, some positives, others not so much. The Asiatic Fleet submarines got a new Rear Admiral, Charles Lockwood. He'd previously been Crawford's boss at the Naval Attaché Station in London, and he believed his captains. He'd also opened a direct line of communication to Admiral King's office on his way over to take up his new command, which was just as well, since in May Admiral Withers was removed from his post commanding the Pacific Fleet submarines and moved to supervise a shipyard. Unfortunately, his replacement, Robert English, was of much the same opinion as Withers when it came to the Mark 14 torpedo and its detonator. The problems this caused became apparent in the aftermath of the Battle of Midway. The creaky old USS Nautilus spent 7 hours duelling with Japanese aircraft and destroyers, its reward being a sight of the damaged and burning carrier Kaga. The captain unleashed a spread of 4 torpedoes, one of which failed to launch, but the other 3 motored off reflecting a perfect bearing. One passed Kaga just ahead, another similarly passed just astern, and the last hit the ship dead centre, where it promptly failed to explode. The only contribution, thus, that the Valiant sub made was in providing a somewhat unexpected life raft for Assistant Damage Control Officer Yoshio Kunisada, who found himself in the water alongside the main body of the torpedo, whose warhead had snapped off inside the carrier's hull, after which the somewhat lighter main section had floated to the surface. Back in Australia, now home to what was left of the Asiatic Fleet, Lockwood was by June being told by Buord that his captains were just incompetent and there was nothing wrong with the torpedoes. Irritated, Lockwood set up his own test facility and proved that the torpedoes were running a dozen feet too deep, exactly as his men were reporting. Buord then claimed his tests were invalid, mostly on the grounds that they hadn't been involved. Lockwood binned their reply, sent his data through his direct link back to Admiral King's office, and ordered the subs to change all their depth settings anyway. Whilst the backroom fight to give them viable weapons continued, US subs found other ways to be useful. In April, USS Sea Raven snuck up to the enemy-held coastline and rescued 32 Australian pilots, although this welcome feat was somewhat mitigated by the fact that Sea Raven's main electrical control panel caught fire on the way back, crippling it. Luckily, USS Snapper was able to come out and tow her home before she was discovered by the Japanese. USS Spearfish turned up in May with a mixed bag of nurses and naval crew who were pretty much the last people to escape Corregidor before it fell. On the way to the embattled outpost, the Spearfish's captain had also managed to hit 2 Japanese cargo ships, courtesy of Lockwood's changed torpedo settings. USS Skipjack likewise claimed 3 freighters on its patrol, and USS Tautog, a transfer from the Pacific Fleet subs, showed up having transited to Australia from Pearl Harbor via various Japanese-held islands, having claimed the Japanese submarines RO-30 and I-28. The Salmon thought that she'd bagged the cruiser Yubari, but had in fact, if anything, actually sunk a far more valuable target, the 11,441-ton Asahi, a repair ship loaded with spare parts, equipment, and machine shops to support the Japanese Navy's war efforts. 1942 continued to grind onwards, and in the 9 months after March, only 3 more subs would be lost, none to enemy action. S-27 and S-39 were both accidentally wrecked going aground, and Grunion fell victim to the Mark 14 torpedo. She'd fired 4 torpedoes at the cargo ship Kano Maru, the first of which went deep and ran under the ship. The next 2 hit the ship but failed to explode, and the last one missed and instead circled back in a wide arc, coming around to smash into the conning tower of the Grunion, again without exploding. Crippled, the submarine fell below its crush depth and imploded. Back in Australia, Lockwood was trying to make other improvements. He'd based a small fuel lighter on the northwest Australian coast, which added 4 days' endurance to his submarines, as they could now top up their fuel tanks on what was almost the last friendly coast before they headed into danger. He also upgraded the facilities at Fremantle to allow the largest US fleet subs to be hauled out of the water for repairs and cleaning, whilst contending with an ever-shortening supply of torpedoes, at one point having to send out subs 4 torpedoes short of a full complement, just to ensure that all submarines at least had a few. Still, the number of enemy ships hit climbed in early summer, although by midsummer this dropped off again as the Japanese consolidated their new gains and the shipping routes changed. By autumn, some further relief was granted as most of the surviving geriatric S-class boats, who'd by now seen out almost a year of war in the tropics without any air conditioning at all, were sent back to the United States as training craft and replaced by modern Gato-type subs, although before that departure S-44 had scored a measure of revenge for the First Battle of Savo Island, sinking the heavy cruiser Kako on its return journey. Unfortunately, the press would prove to be a more deadly enemy than the Japanese in this time period, as an article was printed in public stating that American submarines did not fear Japanese destroyers because their depth charges were neither heavy enough to damage them, nor set deep enough to reach them. Mysteriously, in late 1942, the Japanese Navy suddenly massively increased the depth settings on their depth charges, something which would have significant effects going into 1943. Also, by autumn, the torpedo situation was becoming even more critical. A total of 36 new torpedoes had arrived in August and September combined, but US subs based in Australia had expended 153 in the same time period. Thus, 5 submarines were given 8 torpedoes each instead of their usual 24, and otherwise loaded up with mines, and then assigned to lay 5 minefields simultaneously instead. As the Guadalcanal campaign developed, subs were also called on to deliver critical supplies and stand by to rescue downed airmen, especially with the battles of the Eastern Solomons and Santa Cruz Islands developing and constant operations around Henderson Field. US subs also began to concentrate on attacking enemy supply ships in this particular combat area, whilst delivering coast watchers behind enemy lines, picking up others who needed relief, as well as landing and picking up small teams of soldiers and the occasional behind-the-line survivor. But as winter drew in, there was some good news. Whilst still far from reliable, the contact-only shallow-run set edition of the Mark 14 was at least somewhat workable, and between this, newer boats, and more aggressive commanders, the toll of Japanese shipping began to climb, with almost as much tonnage sunk in the last 3 months of 1942 as had been sunk in the 10 months of war preceding them. There was still much work to be done, but with the front line stabilised, a limited counteroffensive underway, and improvements to subs, equipment, and most crucially torpedoes gradually getting underway as well, things were beginning to look up for the men of the US submarine service. 1943 would prove to be a crucial year, but that's a story for another time.
That's it for this video. Thanks for watching. If you have a comment or suggestion for a ship to review, let us know in the comments below. Don't forget to comment on the pinned post for dry dock questions.